The radio crackled at 3:47 a.m., and the voice on the other end was crying, not sobbing, not screaming. Just this quiet, broken crying that made my stomach drop 80 feet to the forest floor below. I'd been alone in Watchtower 7 for 6 days when the world stopped making sense, and this was the first human voice I'd heard since the emergency broadcast went silent. My name is Derek Callahan, and I was 3 weeks into a fire watch rotation when the outbreak turned cities into graveyards and roads into death traps. The tower I called home was a relic from the 1960s, all weathered wood and rusted bolts, swaying in strong winds like it might come apart at the seams. But it was mine, and more importantly, it was unreachable. 80 feet of vertical ladder between me and anything that used to be human. The platform at the top was 12 feet by 12 feet, surrounded by windows on all sides, giving me an unobstructed view of 50 square miles of pine forest, rocky ridges and two-lane highways that cut through the wilderness like veins through marble. The solar panels I'd installed last summer hummed on the roof, feeding power to my radio equipment, a satellite phone that stopped working on day 3, and a mini fridge that held exactly 14 bottles of water and half a sandwich I couldn't bring myself to eat. I had supplies for a month if I was careful, 2 months if I was willing to get creative with the dried goods and canned beans stacked in plastic bins along the north wall. That first night, after everything collapsed, I watched the glow on the horizon where Millbrook sat 15 miles east. The town had maybe 3,000 people, a grocery store, a hardware shop, and a diner that served breakfast all day. The glow wasn't streetlights. It was fires spreading block by block, and even from this distance I could hear the faint echo of chaos carried on the wind. Screams, car alarms, the pop, pop, pop of something I didn't want to identify. I'd climbed down the ladder once, on day 2, thinking maybe I should hike to the ranger station 8 miles south and find out what the hell was happening. I made it 30 feet from the tower base before I saw movement in the tree line. 3 figures stumbling through the underbrush with that wrong, jerky gait I'd only seen in movies. Their clothes were torn. One was missing a shoe. Another had something dark smeared across his face that caught the morning light like wet paint. They didn't see me. Or maybe they did, and I was too far away to matter. But I watched them disappear into the forest heading north, and I climbed back up that ladder so fast my hands were bleeding by the time I reached the top. That climb changed something fundamental in how I understood my situation. The tower wasn't just shelter anymore. It was a fortress, impregnable as long as I stayed above the reach of anything that couldn't climb with purpose and coordination. The ladder was my moat, 80 feet of vertical steel that might as well have been an ocean between me and the infected world below. I spent the next 2 days just watching, learning. The binoculars became an extension of my eyes, scanning sectors in systematic sweeps from dawn until my vision blurred too badly to continue. I mapped everything in my head first, then on paper, sketching rough outlines of roads, marking known structures, noting topographical features that might matter for navigation or survival. The infected moved in patterns I started to recognize. They followed sound, they pursued movement, but left alone, without stimuli, they wandered aimlessly like leaves caught in currents they couldn't understand or resist. The radio equipment became my lifeline to a world I could see but no longer touch. I had a long-range transceiver powerful enough to reach other ranger stations, fire departments, even some civilian bands if atmospheric conditions cooperated. Scattered transmissions punctured the static, desperate voices calling out coordinates, begging for help, reporting movements of the infected with increasingly frantic urgency. Some transmissions lasted minutes. Others cut off mid-sentence, and never resumed. I started plotting everything on the large topographic map spread across my workbench, using pushpins and colored markers to track patterns emerging from the chaos. Red pins for infected hordes, the big concentrations that moved like slow-motion avalanches through populated areas. Blue pins for survivor sightings, tiny islands of humanity in an ocean of death. Green pins for potential safe zones, places that seemed secure or defensible based on geography and reports. Black pins for places that went silent mid-transmission, locations I marked and avoided mentioning in future broadcasts. The map filled up fast, and I started to see something others couldn't, not from ground level where every tree was a blind spot, and every hill blocked your view. From 80 feet up, with binoculars and patience, I could track the flow of the infected like watching a slow-motion river change course. They moved in clusters, drawn to sound and movement, funneling through valleys and following roads with an eerie, mindless consistency that suggested some fragment of their former humanity still recognized infrastructure and pathways. They avoided steep terrain. Their deteriorating bodies couldn't handle scrambling over rocks or climbing inclines that required coordination and strength. They got confused by water. I watched a group of 30 spend hours trying to cross a creek that was barely knee-deep, some walking in circles on the bank, others standing motionless in the current like they'd forgotten why they entered. And they were spreading outward from population centers in widening circles, like ripples from stones dropped in a pond, radiating death into the wilderness at a pace I could measure and predict. On day 9, I made my first broadcast. My voice felt strange, too loud in the small space of the tower cab, echoing against windows and walls in a way that made me hyper-aware of my isolation. I kept it simple. Identified my location using ranger designation codes, stated I had a vantage point and working equipment. Offered to relay messages or provide reconnaissance for anyone who needed eyes on terrain they couldn't safely observe themselves. I didn't expect anyone to respond. The airwaves had been mostly static and screaming for 72 hours straight, a cacophony of death and desperation that made silence feel like mercy. But someone answered, a guy named Marcus, holed up in a grain silo 23 miles northwest with his brother and his brother's 2 kids. His voice came through clear and steady, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd kept his head when everything else fell apart. He'd heard me trying to reach anyone with information about Route 47, whether it was clear enough to risk a supply run to a distribution center he'd scouted before communications collapsed. I grabbed my binoculars and spent 40 minutes scanning the landscape, tracking roads through forested valleys, until I found Route 47, traced it with my eyes mile by mile, spotted the overturned semi-truck blocking both lanes at mile marker 19. The trailer had jackknifed, spilling cargo across the asphalt, and a cluster of infected wandered in circles around the wreckage like they were waiting for the driver who died or fled weeks ago. I told Marcus the road was blocked, gave him specific details about the obstruction, estimated the number of infected in the immediate area at 15 to 20, and suggested an alternate route through fire roads that would add miles but keep him away from the main horde. The fire roads were rough, barely maintained even before the collapse, but they cut through terrain too difficult for the infected to navigate efficiently. He'd have to drive slow, watch for washouts and fallen trees, but he'd be safer there than on Route 47 where the infected congregated like commuters in a permanent traffic jam. Marcus went quiet for a moment, and I thought maybe I'd lost the connection, but then he came back with 2 words that hit me harder than anything I'd expected. Thank you. Just thank you, simple and profound, carrying weight those 2 words had never held before the world ended. In that moment, I realized I'd been useful, not just alive, not just surviving, but actually valuable to someone else's continued existence. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced since the outbreak started, and it cut through the isolation like sunlight through storm clouds. If you've ever felt like your existence might actually mean something in the middle of a collapsing world, you'll understand why those two words made me decide to keep broadcasting. Keep watching, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because what came next changed everything about how survivors fought back against the tide of the dead. The calls started coming more frequently after that. At first, just a few people who'd heard my transmission and wanted to know if I could see their locations, tell them what was moving in their area, help them plan escape routes or supply runs. I said yes to all of it. Sleep became something I did in 90-minute intervals between radio checks, catching rest when I could but never for long, because someone might need information I could provide, and timing might be the difference between life and death. I kept a notebook logging every transmission, every name, every location, building a database of survivors and their situations that I could reference quickly when calls came in. The notebook became sacred text, pages filled with cramped handwriting that documented a dying world through the lens of people trying to stay alive in it. Tommy was in an apartment complex in the remains of Millbrook, third floor eastern side, with 5 other guys trying to fortify the building. He checked in every 8 hours like clockwork, giving me updates on infected movement in the town, asking me to pass messages to other survivors he'd lost contact with. His voice carried a nervous energy, words tumbling out fast like he was afraid the connection might cut before he finished speaking. He told me about barricading stairwells with furniture and scavenged materials, about rationing food supplies that dwindled daily, about the sounds the infected made at night when they clustered below his windows. Kevin and his son were moving through the forest in a camper van, trying to reach the mountains where Kevin's brother supposedly had a cabin stocked for emergencies. Kevin was methodical, planning each day's travel with care, asking detailed questions about terrain and infected density. His son was 12, too young for this nightmare, but Kevin's voice held steady determination that spoke of a father who would burn the world down before he let anything happen to his kid. I guided them around 2 major herds and steered them away from a stretch of road where I'd watched a group of survivors get overwhelmed. 3 days earlier, their vehicles surrounded and swarmed until movement stopped and the infected dispersed to hunt for other prey. An older guy named Frank had taken over a fire station in a town I couldn't see from my position, somewhere west beyond the ridgeline that marked the edge of my visibility. But he had good intel on the western sectors, and we started coordinating information, building a bigger picture of how things were shifting across the region. Frank had a military background. I could tell from how he spoke, how he organized information and assessed threats with practiced efficiency. He became my counterpart, another hub in an emerging network of survivors who understood that information was as valuable as ammunition in this new reality. I became a switchboard, a dispatcher, a voice in the dark that meant you weren't completely alone even when the infected surrounded your shelter and the future looked like nothing but hunger and fear. People started calling me Watchtower instead of Derek, and I didn't correct them. Watchtower was easier, cleaner, less personal. Watchtower didn't have a history or a family he couldn't reach, or nightmares about the sounds coming from Millbrook that first night. Watchtower was a function, a service, a voice on the radio that gave coordinates and warnings and occasionally hope when someone needed to hear they might survive another day. Derek Callahan was the guy who cried alone in the dark hours before dawn when exhaustion broke through the walls he'd built. Watchtower was the professional who kept his voice steady when someone called in terrified and needed calm authority more than sympathy. 3 weeks in, I started mapping infected patterns with real precision. I'd spent hundreds of hours observing by then, tracking movement through different times of day and weather conditions, noting how they responded to various stimuli and environmental factors. They moved faster at night, something about darkness making them more active, more aggressive. During the heat of midday, they slowed to a crawl, seeking shade when possible, sometimes standing motionless for hours in shadowed areas like machines in low-power mode. They congregated in areas where they'd last encountered prey, then dispersed after a few days when nothing new showed up. It was like they had short-term memory but no reasoning ability to understand their quarry had moved on. The big herds, hundreds strong, followed highways and power lines like they were still commuting to jobs they'd never work again. Decades of routine burned into neural pathways that outlasted death and reanimation. Smaller groups broke off from the main herds, wandering into the wilderness, getting stuck in ravines or scattered across terrain too rough for their deteriorating bodies to navigate. I'd watch them fall and struggle to rise, watch them get trapped in dense undergrowth or wedged between rocks. And part of me felt something like pity for creatures that used to be human and were now just broken things shambling toward extinction without understanding or purpose. I could predict movements now, not perfectly, but well enough to give survivors advance warning when herds shifted direction or new clusters formed in previously clear areas. When I spotted a herd of maybe 200 infected shuffling south along County Road 12, I had 4 hours to alert everyone in their path. Made broadcasts on multiple frequencies, repeated the warnings, gave specific timelines for when the herd would reach various landmarks along the route. Most of them made it out. I tracked their evacuations through radio check-ins, heard relief in voices when people confirmed they'd relocated to safer positions before the herd arrived. A few didn't respond to my broadcasts, either because they didn't have radios or because they were already gone. And I watched through binoculars as the herd washed over a farmhouse that might have been empty or might have been full of people who didn't have a way to hear my warnings. I added another black pin to my map and tried not to think about the might-have-beens that haunted every decision and every silence. The guilt was something I learned to compartmentalize, stuffing it into mental boxes I could lock away when I needed to function. I couldn't save everyone. Hell, I couldn't save most people. The infected outnumbered survivors by ratios that made optimism feel like delusion. But the ones I could help, the routes I could scout, the warnings I could provide, that had to be enough, because it was all I had to offer from my perch above a dying world. Winter started creeping in around week 5. Temperatures dropped, frost forming on the windows each night, and I burned through my propane supply faster than planned, keeping the small heater running enough to prevent hypothermia. Ice formed on the windows, crystalline patterns that were beautiful and dangerous, forcing me to scrape visibility portals each morning to maintain my observation capabilities. The infected seemed less active in the cold, moving slower, sometimes freezing in place overnight when temperatures plummeted and not resuming their wandering until the sun thawed them out enough to function. It bought survivors more time, wider margins of safety, but it also made resources more critical. Food was becoming the central issue in every transmission. People were running out, getting desperate, taking bigger risks for smaller payoffs. The easy scavenging was done. Stores picked clean, homes ransacked by other survivors or destroyed by the infected. Finding supplies now meant going deeper into dangerous territory, into places the infected had claimed through sheer numbers. I coordinated 3 supply runs in late October, talking groups through routes to abandoned stores, watching their progress from above, calling out threats they couldn't see from ground level. 2 runs succeeded. Groups got in, grabbed what they needed, extracted before the infected could swarm their positions. I heard joy in those voices, actual joy, when they confirmed they'd secured food and medicine that would keep them alive for another month. One run ended with screaming on the radio, and then silence. I couldn't break no matter how many times I called their names. 4 guys trying to reach a pharmacy in a strip mall, moving at dusk when visibility was fading and the infected were becoming more active. I lost sight of them in shadows, called warnings about movement I could barely track through the darkness, heard gunfire and shouting, and then nothing but static that howled through my speakers like the wind outside my tower. More black pins on a map that was starting to look more black than any other color. Marcus contacted me on day 38 with a problem that would test everything I'd learned about coordination and surveillance. His brother was sick, not infected, just sick from regular pre-apocalypse causes that used to mean a doctor visit and prescription. Pneumonia maybe, or bronchitis, something respiratory that was getting worse, turning dangerous in an environment where medical care had become mythology. They needed antibiotics, real medicine, not folk remedies or hope dressed up as treatment. The nearest pharmacy that might still have supplies was in Millbrook, and Millbrook was a death trap, swarming with infected who'd congregated in the town center like they were waiting for something that would never come. I'd watched the town for weeks, seen the infected density increase as stragglers from surrounding areas drifted toward the population center, drawn by instinct or scent or whatever fragments of memory told them cities meant people meant prey. But there was a veterinary clinic on the outskirts, northern edge, near the old lumber mill. I'd watched it through my scope a dozen times during routine surveillance sweeps. Noted the infected presence was lighter there, just a handful wandering the parking lot at any given time. The clinic was small, single-story, with vehicle access from multiple angles. If Marcus could get in and out fast, if he timed it right and kept noise to a minimum, he might make it. Might being the operative word, carrying weight that sat in my chest like lead. I spent 2 hours plotting the route, checking and rechecking sight lines, infected positions, escape options, used every trick I'd learned about predicting movement patterns, calculating where the infected would be at different times based on their observable behavior. I had Marcus wait until dawn when I'd have the best visibility, and the infected were at their slowest, cold and sluggish from overnight temperatures. Then I guided him in, real time, my voice steady on the radio, while my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the binoculars. Called out every movement I saw, every turn he needed to make, every spot to pause, and wait for a cluster to pass. Watched him approach the clinic in a pickup truck that moved slow and quiet, parking behind the building where infected on the street wouldn't have direct line of sight. He disappeared inside for 7 minutes that felt like 7 hours. I kept scanning, tracking every infected in the area, plotting trajectories, calculating response times if something went wrong. 3 infected on the main street, 2 blocks east, 5 more wandering through the residential area to the south. A cluster of 8 near the lumber mill, too far away to respond quickly but close enough to matter if the situation deteriorated. Marcus emerged with a backpack, moving fast but controlled, and that's when things started falling apart. One of the infected in the parking lot turned, some sixth sense or random chance aligning their attention with Marcus's movement. It made a sound not quite human, not quite animal, and started shambling toward him with increasing speed. I warned Marcus, Told him infected approaching from his 2 o'clock estimate 30 seconds before contact. He sprinted for his vehicle. The infected made more noise, that terrible keening that acted like a beacon, and 2 more appeared from around the building corner, cutting off his direct path. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my voice stayed calm. Calling out directions like this was routine. Like I wasn't watching a man I'd talked to for weeks possibly die in real time. Told him to cut left, through the gap between the dumpster and fence line, circle around to his truck from the opposite angle. He followed my directions without question, trusting my vision over his ground-level perspective. 3 infected noticed him. I tracked their pursuit, called out directions, told him when to turn, when to accelerate, when to cut through the gap between 2 buildings that I could see from above, but he'd have to trust was there, because questioning would cost seconds he couldn't afford. He made it. Barely. Engine roaring to life, truck lurching forward, infected grabbing at the tailgate as he pulled away. I heard him gasping on the radio, breathing like he'd run a marathon, thanking me between ragged breaths. Told him to get home, get his brother medicated and check in tonight so I knew everyone was okay. That night, Tommy's voice came through around 10 p.m., asking if I'd heard from Marcus. I confirmed the supply run had succeeded, passed along that everyone was safe, and Tommy laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Man, you're like mission control for the apocalypse up there." Maybe I was. The thought sat with me as I updated my map, added new information from evening reports, calculated shifting patterns that might matter tomorrow or next week. I'd become something I never planned on being, essential, not just helpful, but necessary. People depended on my eyes, my vantage point, my ability to see the bigger picture they couldn't access from ground level, where every decision was made with incomplete information, and hope substituting for certainty. It was responsibility I hadn't asked for, weight I hadn't prepared to carry, and some nights I'd stand at the window staring out at the dark forest, wondering what happened if I made a mistake, if I missed something critical, if my information got someone killed instead of saved. The what-ifs piled up like bodies, invisible weight that made the tower feel smaller each day. But then the radio would crackle, and someone would call in, and I'd push those thoughts down deep, where they couldn't interfere with the work that needed doing. There was no time for self-doubt when Kevin needed guidance through a narrow valley where infected congregated, or Frank needed confirmation about supply cache locations, or new voices appeared on the radio frequencies asking if Watchtower was real or just a legend desperate people told themselves. Week 7 brought snow, and with it, a new complication that would change everything about how I operated. A group of 12 survivors, moving north from the demolished remains of a city I couldn't see from my tower, made contact asking for guidance to safe territory. Their leader was a guy named Dale, ex-military by the sound of him, organized and careful in how he presented information and asked questions. He had good people, supplies, weapons, and a plan to establish a secure camp somewhere defensible where they could actually survive long-term. I suggested the old logging camp 30 miles northwest, up in the hills, where terrain would slow any infected approach, and natural barriers would make defense easier. The camp had been abandoned for years, structures weathered but still standing, with access to fresh water and forest resources. Dale liked it, asked me to scout the route, identify threats, give him waypoints he could navigate by using landmarks and compass bearings. This wasn't a quick supply run or a single-day evacuation. This was a multi-day movement operation with a dozen lives at stake and 100 things that could go wrong. Weather, infected herds, resource scarcity, injuries, equipment failure. Any one factor could cascade into catastrophe. I told Dale I'd do it, but he needed to understand my visibility was limited by weather and darkness. I couldn't guarantee their safety, only improve their odds. He said better odds were more than they'd had in weeks, and that was good enough for people who'd been living with no odds at all. I broke the route into segments, gave him daily objectives, checkpoints where he'd stop and wait for my next update. Coordinated with Frank at the fire station to get ground-level intel on areas I couldn't see clearly from my position. Cross-referenced reports from other survivors about infected movements in their sectors, and built a pathway through the chaos that gave Dale's group their best chance of reaching the logging camp alive. Day 1 went smooth. They made 15 miles, kept noise discipline, avoided the main infected concentrations I'd identified. Day 2, they had to detour around a herd I'd missed because it moved up from the south faster than my projections indicated, weather obscuring my view during critical observation windows. The detour cost them time and brought them close to a residential area where infected density was higher than optimal, but they pushed through without major incident. Day 3, someone in the group got injured, slipped on ice and damaged his ankle badly enough that walking was difficult. Slowed them down, forced them to hole up in an abandoned gas station while I kept watch through the night, scanning sectors around their position, calling out every approaching threat so they could prepare or reposition. Watched the sun come up over a landscape where death wandered in mindless patterns, and guided Dale's group back onto their route once daylight made movement safer. They reached the logging camp on day 5, exhausted, shaken, but alive, all 12 of them. Dale came on the radio and told me they were naming the settlement Watchtower camp after the voice that got them there safely. I told him that was unnecessary, felt like taking credit I hadn't earned. But he said they needed hope, and hope needed a name, and mine was the name they chose to represent survival against odds that should have killed them all. If you've ever carried the weight of lives that aren't yours but depend on you anyway, you know that feeling that sits in your chest like a stone you can't swallow and can't spit out. Stay with me here, because the responsibility got heavier, the stakes got higher, and what happened next would test whether I was actually the guardian they believed in, or just a voice on a radio pretending he knew what he was doing. So make sure to drop a comment below about what you'd do in this situation. After that, things shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't just relaying information anymore, or helping individual survivors navigate through infected territory. I was coordinating movements, helping establish safe zones, connecting survivor groups so they could trade supplies, and share intelligence in ways that multiplied their effectiveness. My tower became the hub, the central point where information flowed in from multiple sources, got processed through my observations and analysis, and flowed back out to people who needed it to make decisions that determined whether they lived or died. Frank started calling me the eye in the sky during our coordination calls. Tommy said I was like air traffic control, but for staying alive instead of managing planes. Marcus told his brother's kids stories about the Watchtower Guardian, who could see everything and kept the monsters away, turning me into mythology for children who needed heroes in a world that had stopped producing them. I was just a guy in a tower with binoculars and a radio, but to them I was something more, something they needed me to be, and I couldn't let them down even when exhaustion made my vision blur and my hands forget how to stop shaking. Sleep deprivation became my constant companion, a fog that never lifted completely, even during the brief rest periods I managed between radio checks and observation sweeps. Month 3 marked the turning point where everything got harder. The infected were evolving, or maybe just adapting, learning in whatever broken way their ruined brains still functioned. They started responding to patterns, avoiding areas where they'd been led into traps, congregating around survivor locations with increasing persistence, like they could smell desperation through walls and barricades. I noticed it first in Millbrook. The herd that had been wandering the downtown area started moving with purpose, flowing toward the apartment complex where Tommy and his group had fortified. Not random shambling, but directed movement, like water finding cracks in a dam. They pressed against the building in waves, testing defenses, withdrawing and returning with greater numbers. It was coordinated in a way that shouldn't have been possible for creatures with minimal brain function. I warned Tommy, told him the pattern had changed, suggested he consider relocating before the pressure became unsustainable. But moving meant exposure, meant traveling through infected territory with limited supplies and nowhere guaranteed safe to go. He said they'd reinforced the lower floors, blocked the stairwells with welded metal and concrete barriers, and had supplies for another month if they rationed carefully. Moving was riskier than staying. The math made sense, and I understood the logic even as something in my gut screamed that staying was the wrong choice. I marked his location on my map with a yellow pin that meant, "Watch closely," and increased my observation frequency of that sector to hourly checks during daylight, and every 2 hours after dark. Watched the infected numbers grow around the apartment complex, clustering with density that turned the street into a sea of bodies that swayed and pressed against barriers with mindless determination. 3 days later, the infected broke through. I was on a call with Kevin, helping him navigate around a small cluster near the mountains where he'd been establishing supply caches, when Tommy's voice exploded through the radio, screaming, not words at first, just raw terror and rage, then fragments of information between bursts of gunfire. They'd breached the ground floor. The barricades had failed, infected pouring through gaps in defenses that should have held. He was yelling coordinates, begging anyone nearby to help, even though everyone monitoring the frequency knew there was nobody close enough to respond in time, giving me casualty counts that climbed as I listened frozen at my station, binoculars pressed to my face, watching the apartment complex through the scope while feeling utterly powerless to affect what was happening 15 miles away. 5 guys became 4, became 3. Names I'd heard dozens of times during radio checks, now attached to death counts delivered in Tommy's increasingly frantic voice. I heard him reloading, heard the wet sounds of infected bodies meeting ammunition, heard him giving orders to survivors I couldn't see, telling them to go higher. Get to the roof, hold the stairwell as long as possible. Then his transmission cut to static that howled through my speakers like accusation-given voice. I tried raising him for 6 hours, called his name until my voice went hoarse and my throat burned. Scanned the apartment complex through my scope and saw infected pouring through windows on the 3rd floor, breaking glass and crawling over each other to access the upper levels. Saw smoke rising from the eastern side where something had caught fire, flames spreading through a building that had been home to 6 men who trusted their defenses and paid for that trust with everything. I saw nothing that looked like survivors escaping. No movement on the roof. No figures breaking through the infected perimeter running for safety. Just the slow consumption of another shelter by a tide that never stopped rising. I placed a black pin over Tommy's position and had to walk away from the radio before I put my fist through something that would leave me bleeding and useless. Stood at the window gulping cold air that burned my lungs, staring at the forest that surrounded my tower like I could find answers in the patterns of pine trees swaying in winter wind. Dale checked in that evening asking if I'd heard from Tommy. Standard coordination call, except his voice carried weight that suggested he already knew something was wrong. I told him what happened, kept my voice flat and factual, because emotion was a luxury I couldn't afford when 6 other survivor groups needed me steady and reliable. Gave him timestamps, casualty estimates, confirmed the apartment complex was lost and Tommy's group should be presumed dead. Dale went quiet for a long moment, then said they'd observe a moment of silence at Watchtower camp tonight and that they'd remember Tommy's name along with the others who'd fallen. He asked if I was okay, which was the first time anyone had asked me that question since the outbreak began. I told him I was fine, which was a lie we both recognized but neither acknowledged because the work didn't stop for grief or trauma, or the weight of accumulating losses. I added Tommy's name to the notebook page where I kept the list. 17 names now. 17 people I'd talked to, helped, guided through the nightmare, who didn't make it to see whatever came after this. 17 voices I'd never hear again, except in the static between transmissions, when the silence got too heavy and my brain filled it with ghosts who asked why I hadn't done more, seen more, warned them better. The losses were accumulating faster than the wins, and the math was starting to feel unsustainable. For every person I helped reach safety, 2 more died in ways I witnessed but couldn't prevent. The tower gave me vision but not power, information but not intervention. And the gap between what I could see and what I could do was a chasm filled with corpses bearing names I'd written in careful handwriting. But the work didn't stop for grief. Kevin reached the mountain cabin 2 days after Tommy died and found it intact, stocked with supplies his brother had been accumulating for years, defensible with clear sightlines and elevation advantages. He set up a radio repeater that extended my effective range another 20 miles, giving me coverage deeper into the high country where more survivors might be hiding. His son was safe. That had to count for something in the arithmetic of horror. Frank's fire station became a coordination center for the western sector, and we developed a system where I'd feed him reconnaissance gathered from my vantage point, and he'd organize ground operations, supply transfers, rescue attempts for people I could spot but couldn't reach from my tower. We saved 30 people in November through coordinated efforts that combined my observation capabilities with his ability to mobilize groups and resources. We lost 11 in the same period. The numbers should have felt like victory, net positive in survival rates, but every loss cut deeper than the winds could heal. Each black pin on my map represented a voice that had trusted me, followed my guidance, believed that Watchtower meant safety, and discovered too late that I was just a man with binoculars who made mistakes and missed threats, and sometimes gave advice that got people killed. Week 14 brought visitors, and not the kind I could help. A group of 8 men, heavily armed, moving with military precision through the forest below my tower. I spotted them at dawn during my first observation sweep, tracked their approach through dense woodland, noted they were avoiding infected with practiced ease that suggested extensive experience operating in contaminated territory. They were heading directly toward my position like they knew exactly where to find me. I watched them reach the base of the ladder. Their leader, a tall guy with a shaved head and tactical gear that looked pristine compared to the ragged survivors I usually dealt with, looked up at my tower and shouted a greeting that sounded friendly, but felt like a threat wrapped in courtesy. His name was Grant. He said they'd been monitoring radio traffic, heard my broadcasts, and admired the operation I was running. Said they were building something bigger, a real settlement with walls and organization and actual security instead of temporary shelters that collapsed under infected pressure. Said they could use someone with my skills and strategic position, and that combining resources would benefit everyone involved. He made it sound like an invitation, an opportunity for collaboration between groups working toward the same goal. But the 8 rifles pointed casually at my ladder made it clear refusal had consequences I wouldn't enjoy. I told Grant I was doing fine on my own, that my tower worked best as a neutral observation post not affiliated with any particular group. Tried to keep my voice steady and reasonable, projecting calm I didn't feel while my mind raced through options that all ended badly. Grant's smile didn't reach his eyes. He said neutrality was a luxury nobody could afford anymore, that the world had divided into those who took what they needed and those who got taken from. Said my tower was valuable real estate, my radio equipment was critical infrastructure, and my observation capabilities were too important to waste on random survivor groups who didn't have the organization to properly utilize intelligence. He gave me 24 hours to think about joining them voluntarily. Said they'd be back tomorrow with a proposal I'd find compelling, and that he hoped I'd make the smart choice because the alternative would be unfortunate for everyone involved. Then they disappeared back into the forest, moving with the same coordinated precision that marked them as dangerous in ways the infected weren't. The infected were a force of nature, destructive but mindless. Grant and his people were organized threats, humans who'd embraced violence as survival strategy and had the skills to make that strategy effective. I got on the radio immediately, contacted Frank and Dale, told them about the visit and Grant's barely concealed ultimatum. Frank knew the group, or knew of them. Called them the Collectors, because they'd been moving through the region consolidating resources and absorbing smaller survivor groups through combination of recruitment and intimidation. Said they'd taken over a warehouse complex 20 miles southwest, fortified it heavily, and were operating like a paramilitary organization with hierarchy and discipline. Dale asked if I wanted extraction, if they should send people to get me out before Grant came back. But abandoning the tower meant losing the observation post, the radio coverage, the central hub that connected survivor groups across 50 miles of territory. If I left, dozens of people lost their eyes in the sky, their coordination center, their advanced warning system against infected movements. The question wasn't whether I'd be safer leaving. The question was how many people would die without Watchtower operational. I told Dale I was staying, told him I'd figure something out, that Grant's group couldn't climb the tower without making themselves vulnerable, and that I had 24 hours to prepare for whatever came next. Tried to sound confident, like I had a plan instead of just stubborn determination not to surrender the position people depended on. That night, I didn't sleep. Spent the hours reinforcing the tower's vulnerabilities, making the ladder more difficult to climb by removing sections of rungs and creating gaps that would slow any ascent. Moved supplies to positions where I could defend the access point if necessary. Inventoried everything I had that could be weaponized, which wasn't much beyond some tools and the knowledge that gravity was an advantage I could exploit. Mostly I just watched the forest, waiting for dawn and whatever it would bring. Grant returned at noon with 12 men instead of 8. They surrounded the tower base, rifles ready, and Grant shouted up. That time was up, and he needed my answer. Said I could come down voluntarily and join their organization with full privileges, or they could wait me out, surround the tower until hunger forced me down, or extract me by force if I proved too stubborn to see reason. I told him the answer was no. Told him my tower stayed independent, my broadcast stayed available to everyone, and I wasn't interested in joining any organization that operated through threats and intimidation. Grant's expression hardened. He said I was making a mistake, that they had resources I needed and patience I'd underestimate. Said they'd be watching, that any supply runs or resupply attempts would be intercepted, and that I'd change my mind once isolation and scarcity made the reality of my situation clear. Then they left, but not far. I tracked them through binoculars as they established a camp half a mile away, positioned where they could observe anyone approaching my tower. They'd turned my fortress into a prison, surrounding it with siege tactics I couldn't counter alone. I got on the radio and explained the situation to Frank and Dale. Told them the collectors were blockading my position, that resupply was compromised, and that I had maybe 3 weeks of food and water before scarcity became critical. If this story has ever made you wonder how far you'd go to protect something bigger than yourself, then you need to hear what happened next. Because the choices I made in the following days would determine whether Watchtower survived or became another casualty in a world that kept taking more than anyone had left to give. Hit that like button and share this with someone who understands that sometimes staying means fighting, and fighting means risking everything you've managed to keep safe. Frank proposed a plan within hours. Said he could mobilize 15 people, coordinate with Dale's group, and break the siege through simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. The collectors had numbers and weapons, but they were spread across territory they couldn't fully control, and concentrated force at a single point could overwhelm their perimeter. It was risky. People would probably die, but if the tower fell or I surrendered to the collectors, the entire network collapsed and dozens of survivor groups lost their coordination center, right when winter was making independent survival nearly impossible. Dale agreed to the plan, said Watchtower Camp could spare 8 people for a rescue operation, that I'd guided them to safety, and they weren't going to abandon me when I needed help. His voice carried determination that made my chest tight with gratitude I couldn't properly express. We planned the operation for 3 days out, giving time to coordinate movements and position people without alerting the collectors to incoming threats. I provided reconnaissance, tracking collector movements and identifying weaknesses in their perimeter, finding patterns in their patrol schedules that created windows of vulnerability. The waiting was worse than the action would be. I maintained normal broadcasting, providing intelligence and coordination to survivor groups who didn't know their lifeline was surrounded by hostiles who wanted to control it. Rationed supplies more carefully, calculating consumption rates against uncertain timelines. Watched the collector camp through my scope and tried not to think about how many ways the rescue could fail. Kevin called in on day 2 of the siege asking why my broadcasts had become less frequent. I explained the situation, told him I was dealing with complications but still operational. His response was immediate. He was coming down from the mountains, bringing supplies and firepower. And if the collectors wanted a fight, they'd get one from someone who'd spent the last month surviving impossible situations, with guidance from a voice on the radio he owed his life to. I told Kevin to stay where he was, that the risk wasn't worth it, that his son needed him safe in the mountain cabin. But Kevin said his son needed him to be the kind of man who helped people who'd helped them, and that teaching that lesson mattered more than temporary safety. The rescue happened at dawn on the 4th day of the siege. Frank's group came from the west, moving fast through terrain I'd identified as least defended. Dale's people pushed from the north, coordinated timing putting pressure on multiple points simultaneously. Kevin appeared from the east, solo operator, moving with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to fear, who'd already survived his worst nightmares and found strength in the aftermath. I provided real-time coordination, watching the operation unfold from my position, calling out collector movements and repositioning, directing the rescue groups through gaps and weak points in the perimeter. It felt strange being the objective instead of the observer, having people risk their lives for mine instead of just following my guidance toward their own survival. The collectors weren't prepared for organized resistance. They'd expected isolated survivors, easy targets, who'd scatter under pressure. Instead, they got coordinated assault from 3 directions by people who'd been surviving through cooperation and shared intelligence. The fight lasted less than 20 minutes. 3 collectors dead, 5 wounded. The rest scattered or retreating toward their warehouse complex. 2 of Frank's people were injured, 1 seriously. Dale lost a guy named Raymond, who took bullets covering an advance, died making sure others could reach the tower base. Kevin made it through untouched, climbed the ladder with supplies strapped to his back, grinning despite the circumstances when he reached the platform, and shook my hand. I finally met the people I'd been talking to for months, faces to voices, physical presence to radio signals. Frank was older than I'd imagined, gray-haired and scarred. Dale was younger, intensity in his eyes that spoke of too much responsibility accepted too young. Kevin looked exhausted but determined, a father who'd crossed dangerous territory because principle mattered more than safety. They stayed for 3 hours, bringing supplies that extended my operational timeline another month, reinforcing the tower's defenses, discussing what came next in a region where the collectors would remember this humiliation and plan retaliation. Frank suggested moving the coordination center to his fire station, somewhere more defensible with ground support. But relocating meant losing the observation advantage, the elevation and visibility that made Watchtower valuable. Dale proposed rotating security details, people stationed at the tower base to prevent future siege attempts. I appreciated both offers, but knew the reality. Keeping Watchtower operational meant accepting risk that couldn't be fully mitigated. The tower's value was its position, and my willingness to stay vulnerable to maintain it. That was the price of being useful in a world where utility meant survival for people I'd never meet who depended on a voice they called Watchtower. After they left, I got back on the radio and resumed normal operations. Broadcast at Watchtower was still operational, still watching, still available for any survivor who needed eyes they didn't have or information they couldn't access. The response was immediate, voices expressing relief, saying they'd been worried when transmissions became irregular. Tommy's death had taught me that guidance wasn't guaranteed. Raymond's sacrifice had shown me that my survival had cost others paid in blood. But the network kept functioning. People kept surviving because of coordinated intelligence. And abandoning the tower meant abandoning everyone who'd come to depend on it. Month 4 brought winter in earnest, snow accumulating in drifts that changed the landscape, temperature dropping until exposed skin risked frostbite within minutes. The infected slowed dramatically, cold affecting whatever processes kept their bodies moving. Some froze solid overnight, becoming statues that wouldn't thaw until spring. Others moved with glacial slowness, less threatening but more persistent, wandering through snowdrifts without purpose or destination. Survivor groups consolidated for winter, smaller camps combining resources or relocating to more defensible positions where heat and food could be managed collectively. I coordinated several winter migrations, guiding groups through terrain where infected were sparse, and conditions allowed travel despite snow and ice. Watchtower camp grew to 30 people by December. Kevin's cabin became a supply depot and medical station. Frank's fire station operated as Western Command, coordinating 5 smaller survivor groups in territories I couldn't see directly. The network was expanding, becoming more organized, transforming from scattered individuals into an actual resistance structure. The collectors attacked the tower once more, 6 weeks after the first siege broke. Came at night with intent to burn me out, setting fire to the structure's base where wooden supports were most vulnerable. I spotted them approaching, broadcast warning to nearby groups, and defended the position with improvised weapons, while the tower filled with smoke and heat. Frank's people arrived in time to drive the collectors off, extinguish the fire before structural damage became critical. But the attack proved that Grant's group hadn't forgotten, that they'd keep trying until they either captured the tower or destroyed it out of spite. Dale suggested a fence instead of waiting for the next attack. Said the collector warehouse was a known location, that striking them directly would eliminate the threat permanently. Frank agreed, started planning an operation that would require coordination between multiple groups and timing that couldn't afford mistakes. I provided reconnaissance of the warehouse complex, using my vantage point to map defenses and identify vulnerabilities even though the location was at the edge of my effective observation range. Spent days gathering intelligence, building a tactical picture that would give the assault force their best chance of success. The attack happened in January, 37 people coordinating against a fortified position that held maybe 50 collectors. The fight was brutal, close quarters combat in confined spaces, where the infected were almost less dangerous than organized humans willing to kill, to maintain control of resources they'd claimed. We lost 9 people. The collectors lost 23 in their warehouse. The survivors scattered, some joining our network, others disappearing into territory we didn't control. Grant died in the fighting, killed by Dale in a confrontation I didn't witness, but heard about through after-action reports. The victory felt hollow. 23 human deaths, however necessary for self-defense, represented 23 people who might have contributed to collective survival instead of becoming corpses in a warehouse that smelled like blood and cordite. But Grant's group had made their choice, embraced predation over cooperation, and paid the inevitable price. If you're still with me, wondering whether survival is worth the cost we keep paying in pieces of our humanity, then stay close, because we're approaching the part where I had to decide what Watchtower actually meant, and whether the voice on the radio could become something more than just a witness to how civilization ended. Don't forget to leave a comment about whether you'd have done things differently. And make sure you're subscribed, because this story's ending will change how you think about what it means to be the voice people hear when everything else has gone silent. Winter deepened, and the infected became less of an immediate threat, frozen or slow enough that avoiding them was easier than during the outbreak's early months. The real danger became cold, starvation, isolation-induced despair. I tracked 3 suicides through the winter, survivors who gave up when the accumulation of loss exceeded their capacity to endure. Each one got a black pin and a notation in my book, names I'd spoken to who chose endings I couldn't prevent. By February, the network included 47 survivor groups, ranging from individuals hiding alone to camps housing 30 people. I knew their locations, their resources, their capabilities, their needs. The map had become a living document, constantly updated, showing a region where human civilization persisted in fragments that refused to fully surrender to extinction. Communication evolved beyond survival coordination. People shared stories, memories of the before times, plans for potential futures if the infected ever fully deteriorated, and reclaiming territory became possible. Kevin's son learned to read using instruction books from the cabin library, his father's voice reading lessons over the radio, because education mattered even when survival consumed most energy and attention. A group in the southern sector started farming in a greenhouse they'd secured, growing vegetables that supplemented scavenged supplies. Frank's fire station established a medical clinic with actual trained personnel, 2 doctors and a nurse who'd survived the outbreak and found purpose treating injuries and illness in people who'd otherwise have no access to care. Watchtower Camp became Watchtower Town, permanent structures replacing temporary shelters, population growing as isolated survivors heard the broadcasts and decided the promise of community was worth the risk of travel. Dale became a leader in ways that exceeded his experience, growing into the role because someone had to, and he refused to let people down through cowardice or incompetence. I remained in my tower, watching the slow transformation of horror into something that might eventually resemble civilization. 10 months after the outbreak started, 50 square miles of forest held somewhere between 400 and 500 survivors connected through radio networks and shared determination to outlast the infected. They still called me Watchtower, still depended on my observations and coordination. But I'd become something more than just eyes in the sky. I was the voice that meant you weren't alone. The signal that meant someone was organizing resistance against the dead world. The proof that humanity could rebuild even from ruins that smelled like corpses and burned with fires that consumed everything familiar. My real name was Derek Callahan, but they didn't know that. They didn't need to know that. Watchtower was enough, a call sign that carried meaning beyond individual identity. Watchtower meant someone was watching. Watchtower meant information you could trust. Watchtower meant that even when the world ended, some things survived to bear witness and guide others through darkness toward whatever came next. The infected were still out there, thousands of them wandering through regions we couldn't reclaim. The collectors were scattered, but not eliminated. Fragments of Grant's organization persisting in territories we didn't control. Winter would eventually end and warmer weather would revitalize threats currently frozen dormant. But we'd survived 10 months, built networks and communities, transformed from isolated individuals into something that resembled organized civilization. And every morning I climbed to my observation post, scanned sectors through binoculars, plotted movements and shared intelligence that kept people alive another day. The radio crackled with voices asking for guidance, reporting discoveries, sharing news both good and terrible. I answered every call I could, maintained the coordination center that had become essential infrastructure, played the role of Watchtower, because that's what people needed, and I'd accepted responsibility for being what they needed. 80 feet above the forest floor, surrounded by windows that showed me 50 square miles of reclaimed and contested territory, I kept watching, kept broadcasting, kept being the voice on the radio that gave hope to scattered survivors who never knew my real name. Just that my voice meant someone was still out there organizing resistance against the dead world. And that was enough. It had to be enough, because in the end, survival wasn't about individual safety or personal comfort. It was about being useful to something larger than yourself, about choosing to keep functioning when stopping would be easier, about being the voice that answers when someone calls into the darkness hoping for proof they aren't completely alone. I was Watchtower. And as long as the solar panels kept generating power and the radio kept broadcasting, I'd keep watching the world below and guiding the survivors who depended on eyes they didn't have, and information I could provide. That was the choice I'd made. That was the price I'd accepted. And I'd keep paying it for as long as my voice could reach through the static to find the people who needed to hear that someone was still watching. Still coordinating, still fighting to preserve fragments of humanity in a world the dead had claimed, but the living refused to fully surrender.